Latin 2, Grammar for Chapter 5, Latin for the New Millennium, Level 2, Second Edition. Part 2 of the Chapter 5 Grammar, Indirect Commands. We have learned about indirect statements. Indirect statements are just reported statements. For instance, if we have the direct statement, Marcus sees the girl, which in Latin is Marcus puellum videt, we need to be able to report that. And we report that using the forms of indirect statement. In English we say, Gaius says that Marcus sees the girl. That Marcus sees the girl is the indirect statement form of Marcus sees the girl. In English we mark indirect statements with the subordinating conjunction that. Latin does not generally use a word like that. Instead, what it does for indirect statements is it takes the subject of the direct statement and puts it in the accusative, and it takes the conjugated verb of the direct statement and makes it into an infinitive. So we wind up with this, Gaius dicit Marcum puellum videre. Gaius says Marcus to see the girl. This is how Latin says Gaius says that Marcus sees the girl. We have also learned about indirect questions. Indirect questions are just reported questions. For instance, whom does Julia love? Quem Julia amat in Latin? The indirect question form of whom does Julia love in English is whom Julia loved. We can say Gaius asked whom Julia loved, and whom Julia loved is a report of Gaius's actual direct question, whom does Julia love? In Latin, we can say Gaius rogavit, Gaius asked whom Julia loved. Latin, generally speaking, preserves the form of the direct question and indirect questions. Notice that quem Julia amat looks an awful lot like quem Julia amatat. The only difference is that in indirect questions in Latin, verbs must be in the subjunctive, so the verb amat must change to amatet. We're in secondary sequence here because rogavit is in the past tense, and we are limited in secondary sequence for the subjunctive to the imperfect and the pluperfect. We use the imperfect subjunctive here because this amatet is incomplete with respect to rogavit. We are now going to learn about indirect commands. Indirect commands are just reported commands. Let's say I have the direct command, eat your dinner, comede cenam. Here's how the indirect commands look in English. We're going to use the word begged. We could use a word for command or order, but we're not going to because they work slightly strangely in Latin, so we're going to use the word begged. But the idea is the same. We are essentially conveying Gaius's order to eat my dinner. And so we can say in English, Gaius begged me to eat my dinner. Note how in English we use an infinitive, generally speaking, for indirect commands. Not always, but generally speaking. In Latin, this becomes Gaius oravit me ut canem comederem. Gaius begged me that I eat my dinner. In form, indirect commands usually look like purpose clauses. They begin with ut or ne, just like a purpose clause. Ut for positive, ne for negative. And they have a subjunctive verb. The verb must be present in primary sequence and imperfect in secondary sequence. That's because orders can only be for the future. You can't order to do something in the past, so perfect and pluperfect subjunctives can't be used in them. I can't say things to you like, go home yesterday, right? Or I order you to go home yesterday. It doesn't make sense. Here's an example. I beg you to come to me. Te oro, in Latin, I beg you, ut ad me venias, that you come to me. So I beg you that you come to me. And that's how Latin says, I beg you to come to me. It uses an ut clause here with the subjunctive. Here's another example. I begged you not to come to me. That's te oravi ne ad me venires. The ne indicates that this is a negative indirect command, and this is literally, I begged you that you not come to me. And that's how Latin says, I beg you not to come to me. So the forms are exactly the same as the forms for purpose clauses. You can only tell by the context whether you're dealing with a purpose clause or an indirect command. Note that in English, we usually express indirect commands with infinitives. Not always, but generally. Sometimes Latin uses an accusative and infinitive like English to express indirect commands. Here's an example. This is generally the case with iubeo, iubere, iusi, iusis. I order you to come to me in Latin is te iubeo ad me venire if you use the verb iubeo. It works just like English. I order you to come, infinitive, to me. The end.